سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to part 2, the second episode on the Islamic calendar according to Muslims in the UK. In this episode, we're going to listen to some responses from position 1. Last episode, we introduced the topic. We also then put the argument against position 1, as that's where the move is happening, where position 2 and 3 were suggesting, or rather pushing for a move away from position 1. And they had built, or I had researched that. They had not built this case. I myself personally researched this fairly, honestly, with an open mind, and gathered information which seemed to put position 1 in a very, very, very difficult situation from a number of positions, whether from a legal fiqh basis, either based on shahada, either based on qada, also based upon a physical physics, due to the concept of physics of moon and sighting of the moon, and it put the situation in a very, very bleak place. We're now going to, as I said in this part, let's listen to some of the responses from position 1 and then give opportunity for position 2 and 3 to rebut against them. 4.1, so this is the first response. In response, position 1 declares that astronomical calculated dates are unreliable and the hilal can be seen at times which may be deemed impossible, which according to the Danjon limit of elongation of 7 degrees. Now the Danjon limit states that below 7 degrees no light is reflected from the moon and therefore cannot be seen from Earth. There's a record which was set in 1871 that a moon of 15.4 hours was seen when it was at an elongation of 9.3 degrees, and in more recent times between 17 and 21 hours at an elongation of 10.5 degrees. So this is but 7 degrees is even lower than that. It's talking maybe about 12 hours or something approximately. In position 1 documentation, Dr. Jim Stam's observation carried out in Tucson, Arizona in October 2007 is suggested as evidence in proving the moon can be sighted below the Danjon limit. Other reports have been added of various astronomers. However, there are no references for these statements, or they are not in full. And I've given you references in the article, one on page 29, for you to be able to go to those links directly, assuming they're still there. They were at the time the paper was put together about 2 years ago. Or they are denied by the astronomers themselves. Martin Elasa, for example, emails have been seen by the author, and he denies that he made those statements. So there's a little bit of tomfoolery going on, a little bit of hanky-panky. In fact, it is appropriate to quote the relevant part of Elasa's email from position 2 documentation, in which he says, "We all know that astronomical calculations of position of the celestial bodies are extremely precise. This can be proven anytime, any place, again and again by the precise prediction of the observable events. My daytime observations rely on this fact, so that I can point my telescope at the calculated position of the crescent without seeing it visually. Of course, local weather conditions influence the visibility of these events, but only in a negative way, meaning that it will obscure a situation, it will never improve the possibility of seeing it. Any visibility claim that contradicts these bases, such as seeing a crescent that had already set, is obviously false." So the very person who's being used as proof that it can be seen below 7 degrees, in emails that I've seen myself, he clearly argues the case contrary. The key point is that any influence on the visibility would be in a negative way, meaning in the delaying of the seeing, not improving in seeing it. Again, with respect to Stam's sighting in Tucson, it can be recorded in a correspondence with Mustafa, in which he draws a comparison between his sighting and the original record by Stam, bearing in mind that both are using telescopes. And I've recorded the key details here on table 1 on page 30. And you can see that the age of the moon at sunset was 13 hours for the KACST's record, and 17 so where have I gone there, sorry. And again, just short of 13 hours for Arizona's record. The angular separation, the degrees that we refer to, is 7 and 7.5, and therefore you can see here that that was the best that they'd seen. Okay, and this is again using a telescope. This was the youngest that it's never been seen beneath that. Then Mustafa made a bravado claim on the KACST website that he had broken this record on March the 14th, 2002 by claiming that he'd sighted the moon at 4 degrees elevation. However, this is very doubtful, as a year later he would correspond with the journal The Observatory and make a lesser claim of 7 degrees. So, a bit of a bravado claim. So again, you've got to be able to see through the weeds and see through the mud in order to be able to get to the gold and get to the facts as to what is being said. And this kind of critical analysis and this methodology is very important in order to get to the truth. Hassan Zada, who carried out an extensive research on the Danjon limit and its relationship with the moon crescent sighting, and Andre Danjon, who was an astrophysicist in 1931, he collected 75 observation reports from all over Europe, and he noticed that the separation angle of the moon and the sun reduces, then the length of the arc shortens. Then basically what he's saying is that an angle of 7 degrees, it reached 0, and then the moon, no part of the moon is bright. When it's not bright, it's impossible to see it, because it has to reflect light in order for us to be able to see it. Hassan Zada mentions a work by McNally in which he reckoned it was 5 degrees, Fatuhi considered to be 7.5, and Sultan used the Blackwell model calculated to be 5. Hassan Zada used 74 observational data here, and then he has his analysis of his results. But again, it's appreciated that the telescope is sighting the moon significantly earlier than the eye alone. On average, the telescope is sighting it around 7.91 degree of separation, whereas the eye is seeing it at 16.3. So the eye is seeing it a lot later. By plotting and finally extrapolating the results, he's found a theoretical 5 degrees. So this 5 degrees he mentions is via extrapolation. And as most of us will know when it comes to maths, extrapolating doesn't necessarily mean that that data is factual, because it's outside of the data set. And any conclusion that one draws from anything outside of the data set is speculative at best. And in this case, hardly reliable. He does mention a number of individuals who have claimed to have detected the crescent below the Danjon limit, and we have some discussion along those sorts of lines. But what we're finding is that the kit that's being used is very much a high-level kit in order to reach that kind of decision. And Elassa does mention that due to the numerous technical means required to capture this faint lunar crescent, these images probably do not show what could be seen through a telescope. It is quite possible, he says, that the lunar crescent will never be visible to human eyes from Earth at these elongations due to the low contrast. Of course, the lunar crescent is still there, even if we cannot see it with the naked eye. The main reason for using cameras is to capture things that I could not see and to document these. So what he's looking at is literally the birth of the moon more than anything else. Legault from France mentions, from the shooting site, the angular separation between the moon and the sun was only 4.55. At this very small separation, the crescent is extremely thin, and above all, it is drowned in the solar glare, the blue sky being about 400 times brighter. So the sky itself is brighter than the moon, and it is in itself in infrared, and probably more than 1,000 times in visible light. So that's in infrared is 400 times brighter. In normal light, it's 1,000 times brighter. This explains that it has never been observed visually or even photographed until now. In order to reduce the glare, the images have been taken in close infrared, and a paced screen placed just in front of the telescope prevents the sunlight from entering directly into the telescope. He then offers some advice for Muslims. He says, most Muslims consider the visibility of the first crescent after the new moon to determine the beginning of Ramadan. But this vision must be performed visually without optical instruments and not photographically. Meaning, you can't look at a photograph. So basically what he's arguing, or just to summarize what's been said, is that an image is taken, and it's usually by a sort of a CCD image. An image is taken, and on the image you can see the crescent. So the argument is that the crescent is there, but it can't be seen. We have to use different filters, we have to use different lights in order to be able to show it. And then you're looking at the photograph and saying, ah, look, there's a crescent. But he's saying, look, that's not right, because the Muslims have to actually see the crescent in the sky. But it's impossible to see it in the sky at these lower levels, below 7 degrees. It's impossible to see it because of the contrast in light in the sky, that the actual sky itself is much brighter. So he's saying it's not correct to use photographic images as evidence, as the moon can be seen at conjunction or just after, because, as I mentioned, the Danjon limit refers to visible light wavelength and not to CCD imaging from infrared wavelength, which is what they are using. So CCD imaging is incorrect. And you can see some of these CCD imaging. You'll see that on page 32. And also you'll see another image of CCD image from the KSA, which is on page 40. Okay. Now again, it had to be, well, maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but I'll just mention it now that I've got there. Again, it has to be borne in mind that this is not a photograph of the crescent seen through human eyes or through a telescope. But this is using infrared, it's using CCD imaging to take a picture of the crescent, and then there's looking at the picture and saying, ah, look, there's a crescent. But that crescent would not be seen. So again, this is this great desire to kind of beat one another, that, oh, I saw it first, I saw it before you, or I got below the Danjon, I saw it at 4.5, I saw it at 4, I saw it at 3. So it's very sort of competitive to be the first person to see the moon. But at the end of the day, it's the realistic and the rules which have been placed on us by the Sharia that has to be borne in mind. So Mustafa discusses this new Saudi criterion in his paper. He highlights that Danjon's criterion 7 degrees in that he deduced that the crescent cannot be seen if it is less than this value from the sun, regardless of the moon's age or any observing conditions. And I'm not going to go too much in because I already know, I can imagine some of you, the technicalities are sort of, boring you a little bit now. But again, for those who aren't bored and, sort of sat on the edge of your seats, you can read the paper in full from the website that I've given you, and you'll find all the information there. So I want to move on now to table 3. And in table 3, what we have here is by a chap called Gent, in which he mentions that the official moon sighting committees were set up to determine sighting. However, the religious authorities also allowed testimony from less experienced observers, and as a result they announced the sighting of the lunar crescent on an evening when none of the official committees could observe the lunar crescent, or even on an evening where the lunar crescent actually set before the sun. He goes on further to state that in nearly all of these cases, a retrospective analysis indicates, meaning getting the data and looking back at the data, that these extremely early reports of the lunar crescent are impossible and are based on false sightings. Most of these false sightings were probably caused by a bright star or a planet, most likely Venus, or an airplane contrail viewed near to the western horizon. He then summarized his analysis of the last 14 years. And you can see this table that I've put together on page 34. And on there, you can see the computed dates are based on the al-Qura calendar, which is the latest criteria, except the first year. And the announcements were made on Fatwa Online. Out of a total of 42 months, which we already mentioned, there are only 3 cases in which the Ramadan moon was sighted on the evening after the evening of probability predicted by the al-Qura calendar. And they're the ones which you can see in sort of blue color. So you'll get this in green, but the blue color that we're talking about, they're the 3 that we're talking about, a day after. So 26th, al-Qura said it was announced on the 27th. 9th, al-Qura said it was announced on the 10th. 28th, al-Qura said it was announced on the 29th. That's only 3. That's not too much of a problem, he said, because, however, the cause for concern is that on 7 occasions, the moon was sighted on the evening before. Okay, that's where he says it's a concern. Predicted by the al-Qura, in which the moon set occurred before the sunset. In these 7 occasions, there would have been an extra day, which would have made the month 31 days. This is not possible within an Islamic month. The only way around this is to have 2 Gregorian days with the same Islamic date. That's the only way around it. And that's the way they found their way around it when the announcements were then made. In response, position 1 states that we cannot utilize astronomical data as we are told to cite. But there is much written in this area. There was an international conference held in Mecca on the 11th to the 13th of February 2012, in which many Muslim scholars from many nations gathered together to discuss this moon sighting declaration from KSA. And they proposed the use of astronomical calculations to dismiss outlier sightings. So here's a rough translation, and it picks up from the third opinion. The third opinion is that although calculations cannot be exclusively used for sighting, which everybody agrees, of the moon, but if calculations negate the possibility of a sighting on a particular day, i.e. the moon set before the sunset, and a person testifies to that sighting of the moon, then such a testimony will not be considered authentic. Majority of the attendees agreed with this third opinion, and I also proved this opinion with evidence in my presentation. I is not me in this case. This is a translation of what Mufti Taqi Usmani Sahib said. So when I said I there, that's not me. This is a presentation he put to the KSA. Since this opinion is against the opinion held by the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, he didn't agree, even though everybody else there agreed, and the prevailing local practice, therefore, his opinion was thoroughly debated and discussed. Those who agreed with this opinion argue that this does not mean that calculations are being exclusively used to replace sighting. Rather, the purpose of calculations is to investigate the testimonies, as the testimony only becomes authentic when it can be relied upon. Meaning, at the moment, it's just data. It is not a ruling. The data becomes a ruling only when the data is presented to the Qadi and the Qadi accepts it, acts upon it. Now it's become evidence, because it's now admitted into court as evidence. Thus, if a person testifies to sighting the moon in the wrong direction, then it cannot be relied upon. Similarly, if a person testifies to the sighting of the moon when it can be conclusively proven with calculations that moonset occurred before sunset, then such a testimony is not acceptable due to being doubtful. I narrated the detailed treatise of Allama Taqiyuddin as-Subki in my presentation, in which he has also adopted this opinion, and the notion that Allama Taqiyuddin as-Subki is alone in this opinion and against the majority view, and that he has made calculations as opposed to citing the criterion, is negated by Allama Subki himself. After a lengthy discussion, the attendees were in agreement on this opinion. The conference concluded and decided to adopt a number of motions tabled during the conference. Again, it's only the relevant one that I will mention, or the relevant few that I will mention to you. Motion 4. The methodology of astronomical calculations is an established science with principles and rules. There is significant contribution from Muslims and a subject of interest for the Muslim legal experts, and some of the resulting data are worthy of compliance. There are knowledge of the time of conjunction, the setting of the moon before the disappearance of the sun disk, or after it, and the rising of the moon on the horizon on the night after the conjunction, and in what state. It is for this reason that it is necessary for accepting the witnessing of the sighting of the moon that it is not a sighting which is impossible, based upon sound knowledge and that which is produced from the reliable astronomical institutes. This is applicable in situations when the conjunction has not taken place or the moon has set before the sunset, the 2 points which are being mentioned. Motion 7, which was also accepted. The confirming of the beginning of the lunar months which are associated with acts of worship is an issue of the Sharia. As a result, it is under the remit of the authorized scholars of the Sharia from the reliable institutes or those of a similar legal capacity. The remit of the astronomers and the institutes of astronomy is to submit the precise astronomical calculations to the Sharia institutes, like details about the birth of the moon, the place of the hilal, the prediction of the circumstances of the hilal, for instance, where upon the globe it will be seen, and also such matters which will assist the Sharia institutes in issuing a correct, precise decision. Motion 8. The Sharia does not forbid the use of technological developments like the recent astronomical calculations developments or the historical methods of observation in the interests of the people and in their affairs, because Islam does not oppose science and scientific facts. And you can see the full conference details in the Arabic text. So in conclusion, one can see that there's a general agreement amongst the contemporary scholars that astronomical data should be utilized to challenge and dismiss so-called sightings by one or two individuals when it is physically impossible rather, to see the moon, not, underline, bold, to replace or validate sightings. That's a different thing altogether. So, in response, position 1 declares that taking statements of unknown witnesses is a practice of the Prophet ﷺ. This has been discussed when detailing the four schools position, and it is acceptable within the Hanafi school to accept a solitary witnessing for Ramadan on an overcast sky. However, on a clear skies, large group of witnesses are required. Furthermore, as adherents to a school, we must abide by our books of fiqh in matters which has been disclosed, rather than performing ijtihad on the source text. Mufti Taqi again, Uthmani, explains in his text Usul al-Ifta under the chapter of Taghayyur al-Ahkam bi Taghayyur al-Zaman with respect to evaluating witnesses and how the situation changed between Imam Abu Hanifa, where taking a unknown witness was a fine, and then the subsequent Imams Abu Yusuf and Muhammad when it wasn't, because lying became widespread and common. So it needed to be known who was making that statement. In response, position 1 states that we should all follow Qasir for the sake of unity. That's the argument that's given, and that seems to be really the only argument left now, because everything else seems to have been challenged and rebutted easily. Most recently has been argued that for the purpose of unity, rather than adopting the preferred view, one should adopt the lesser view. As both views are deemed correct, then there's no harm. An example offered is a choice which the Prophet ﷺ took by not rebuilding the Kaaba on its original foundations, which was the preferred view, but rather leaving it on its new foundations, which was a lesser view, as the Quraysh had recently accepted Islam. The backdrop to this event is that the Quraysh of Makkah had rebuilt the Kaaba on other than the foundations which the Prophet Ibrahim a.s. had built it. So when Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gained authority of Makkah, he chose not to rebuild it on the original foundations, as he feared due to relative ignorance of the people, there would be confusion and a backlash. However, this analogy is problematic in a number of ways. Firstly, the Quraysh had recently accepted Islam. How can that be leveled at Muslims? Secondly, unity cannot be defined in this way, as unity is described as a way that all Muslims treat each other with respect and not spread disorder, as well as not inventing ideas foreign to Islam which may lead to division and conflict. But more importantly than anything else, unity must be based on the application of the fiqh school being followed, which is based on the Quran and the Hadith. In addition, unity is near impossible, as a significant number will want the more correct view if the premise that both views are correct is applied, if both views are considered to be correct. In response, position 1 states that we cannot act on news from non-Muslim countries when declaring a new month. However, there's some references that I give here, and I'm now keeping this sort of relatively short because I do want to sort of get to the conclusion in the next 5-10 minutes and wrap this up, which is that from we could see earlier that ببلدة, this is أي أو قرية قال في السراج ولو تفرد واحد برؤيته في قرية ليس فيها وال ولم يأتي مصرا ليشهد وهو ثقة يسومون بقوله قلت والظاهر أنه يلزم أهل القرى الصوم بسماع المدافع. So this is referring to the legality of an individual or body of representatives acting on behalf of the Muslims in a Muslim minority setting to determine and execute rulings. In most of my work that you've already seen with respect to Muslim minorities, which I hope you have, you'd have seen that it's important for the Muslim community as a Fardhi Kifaya to set up a group of scholars to be able to carry out and execute rulings. So this would be personal law, this will be on the issue of declaring the start of a new month, declaring the start of Ramadan, declaring the start of Eid. So that is fine, we have that in this country, and therefore we can take that information from another country like, say, South Africa. And if we look at the moon sighting conference in Mecca, motion 6 mentioned, with respect to those countries with a Muslim minority who cannot sight the moon due to some reason, then it is necessary upon them to follow the nearest Muslim majority country or the nearest country with a Muslim community in which the sightings of the moon is established, similar to those Islamic centers and the like. And finally, in response, position 1 states that we cannot utilize the statement of a fasik when declaring the sighting of the moon. But the quote I have here from Radul Muhtar, which is قوله بشهادة فاسق نفذ, it clearly shows that the truthfulness of a suspect witness, then their testimony can be utilized in declaring judgments when it's with supporting evidence. So it proves the truthfulness. And if we look at the most recent Ramadan, obviously that's not this Ramadan, that's Ramadan 2 years ago now in 1436, then we have little evidence of the sighting from KSA except a digital image. So this is what we had in 1436 as the declaration of the sighting of a moon. And really, this is a digital image using a highly powerful camera via infrared, and it's taking an image during the day compared to an announcement of sighting by Morocco at around the same time, which clearly demonstrates the efficiency and timely nature of the news reaching the UK committees from Morocco. And that's what we had there. So KSA declaration is via CCD imaging, which is not valid according to the Sharia, as it is not observed because light reflected from the moon is not entering the eye. And at the same time, information, news of the sighting was brought from Morocco. So that other question of Morocco is not reliable seems to have been a thing of the past, and things have obviously turned for the better. And here is an announcement from Morocco from one of their faxes which was sent. And it says here, the Ministry of Religious Endowments and Islamic Affairs did watch today, pardon the English, obviously it might have been a Google Translate from their Morocco, from their Arabic into their English. The Ministry of Religious Endowments and Islamic Affairs did watch today, Wednesday the 29th of Sha'ban, 1436, corresponding to June the 17th of 2015, and the crescent moon of 1436 Ramadan in the 278 points covering all the territory of the Moroccan kingdom. The sighting proved to be positive according to the rules of the Sharia. Therefore, the first day of Ramadan will be Thursday, June the 18th, 2015. And that came roughly at the same time. So now on to the conclusions. And with the conclusions, one recommendation, and then we will have finished for this particular task, this particular episode, this particular part with respect to the Islamic calendar according to Muslims in the UK. So drawing this lengthy discussion together, so for those of you who don't want to watch 45 minutes or so of part 1 and maybe similar length of part 2, I guess you could just forward it to these conclusions and hit and listen to this part. And those of you who've been asleep, now I guess it's time to wake up and make some notes. We draw a number of conclusions with respect to positions one view which are seriously problematic, and there I'm choosing my words very pragmatically and very, very mercifully, because seriously problematic is, to be honest, an understatement. There is no structure or criterion in place to attempt to sight the moon within the UK. 8 months of the year are based on the al-Qura calendar, therefore based on astronomical calculations. The news, as no declaration is made for the 8 months, is not valid. Due to B, which is 8 months of the year based on the al-Qura calendar, one day which has a single Gregorian date, i.e. English date, West date, has to have 2 Islamic dates in order to retrospectively assimilate the date when following the al-Qura with the date of sighting, which becomes known at a later date. Sha'ban, Ramadan, Shawwal, or Dhul Hijjah, although based on sighting, which is proved to be problematic, can be validated due to the decision of the courts. However, Muslims in the UK are not within the legal jurisdiction of KSA Sharia courts. The news reaching the Muslims in the UK can be considered as legally sound in the cases of Ramadan and Shawwal only, and that is me trying to be as encompassing as possible in order not to suggest a position which would invalidate people's fasts and which would invalidate or would cause sin by celebrating Eid on a day when they should be fasting. There is no agreement between the courts of Saudi Arabia and the Muslims of the UK in order to ensure validity with respect to the 4 so-called Ibadah months. That can be overlooked in the case of Ramadan and Shawwal due to istifada, but would require it for the remaining 2. KSA courts will allow sighting via telescopes and observatories as being discovered, even though the perception exists that unaided sighting is taking place. The unaided eye is what is stipulated, as telescopes could potentially determine the sighting a day earlier. Furthermore, there are reports of the use of CCD imaging, which is invalid for accepting it as a sighting because it is no longer a sighting. According to the fiqh applied in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there will be months where a solitary witness will be accepted by the Saudi courts, but is considered unacceptable according to the Hanafi fiqh when there is a clear sky. And finally, the psychological element has been proven to exist when the starting of months is known due to the al-Qura calendar to those individuals who attempt to sight the moon. Hence, they will attempt to see it and believe they actually have. So from the understanding arrived at following this study, it is my view that adopting position 1, again, I use these words graciously and charitably, is seriously problematic. This does not mean the fasts of Ramadan and Eid of Shawwal are invalid, as there is a scope of permissibility of considering them valid due to the declaration of the courts and its news reaching the UK committees via Sharia means. However, the approach is legally lacking in many areas, and as I said, this is trying to adopt an encompassing approach, trying to be as generous as possible in order not to adopt a position which could invalidate people's fasts. That leaves the two alternatives. That leaves position 2 and position 3. The positions are sound from a legal perspective. However, if pushed to adopt one of the two positions, even though they are similar, then one would suggest position 3. However, this paper was published in 2015, and now here in 2017, I know now that position 2 is very much like position 3, and it's come into sync with position 3. Why at that particular time was it not in sync is the reasons being that there is the possibility that error can creep in due to dependence on imkan and ru'ya for position 2, as the same psychological effect discussed in conclusion I above can cause the one who attempts to cite it to believe that it's not possible to see it. Then there may be a dismissal of a valid citing, assuming it to be something else. Position 3, which is now also what position 2 is, was found to be a well-detailed and structured methodology and criteria based on the Hanafi school. The only use potentially of astronomical data was to dismiss isolated reports, outliers, or in support of an unscrupulous witness. Both are not being used to dismiss sightings, but to determine the veracity of the witness statements, and that's the key part, is to determine how truthful these witnesses are. So finally, is a recommendation, and to see it off, it's my recommendation that the research presented in the study is scrutinized and assessed with great attention. And this is directed at those individuals, particularly who adopt position 1, to fairly and honestly look at this evidence in here. If it's found wanting in certain areas due to lack of data or erroneous conclusions, then please, those who do adopt position 1, forward your information to me, and it will be evaluated and taken into consideration fairly. This may or may not result in a change of analysis or conclusions, mind you, but it will be fairly evaluated and assessed. On the other hand, if what's presented in the study is considered sound, then it is imperative that action is taken. We can't just sit on the sidelines. We can't just sit on our hands when it's quite clear that position 1 is untenable. It is essential that in each city a Hilal committee forms and starts to engage with the masajid. We now have a national organization which does that, so there may not be a need for that, but maybe having small groups of people there to at least be witnesses that can go out on the 29th. Many of those in these said committees, or rather in these said witness groups, will be imams in masjids, and enlightening those responsible of the position which should be adopted for UK Muslims in terms of how to declare a new Islamic month. These Shahada committees can then network through the national body with one another throughout the UK. This will then produce an accurate and uniformed understanding and practice for all the months of the year for the Muslims of UK, particularly for Ramadan and the 2 Eids, which will mean that we will all start Ramadan together and that we will all celebrate Eid together. So it's time to sort of get off our positions, put our whatever is stopping us to one side, and looking at this fairly for the sake of the community, for the sake of unity, and adopting that way forward. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give all those who are listening the tawfiq to act upon and adopt a more correct way in declaring the starts of new months. Ameen. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح يسعك الفضاء